Voice of Culture, a series of podcasts from Amphora Media. Hello, my name is Livia. Together we will be in the cycle of podcasts called The Voice of Culture. I welcome you to this first podcast in this series. This podcast aims to stimulate discussion on topics related to archaeology and cultural heritage. This podcast will take place in the field with our interviews. Please follow us on our website, amphora.al. In this first series, we will be with Carolyn Perry, a freelance lecturer and director of the Al-Jaber Foundation, a British charity working in education and cultural dialogue. Hi, Carolyn. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Livia. It's lovely to be here. Thank you for asking me.
So, the first question, please tell us more about your involvement on your whole career in Britain and also in other countries.
Thank you. So I live in Durres now, but I only moved here just over 3 years ago. And previously I lived in the UK. I grew up in the UK and was educated there. But I've had a career that has taken me to lots of different countries, so I'm very lucky. So I have worked in the museum sector and in the education sector, and part of my job has been to take people around in tour groups, looking at cultural heritage sites, investigating the history and archaeology of different countries. And I've been doing this now since 1997, so a very long time. I started in Greece, but I've also taken tours in Syria and in Iran and in Albania since 2007. So I loved Albania so much, I decided to come and live here. And I've been living here now, as I say, for more than 3 years. And there's still a lot to discover. It's a really fascinating country and it has an incredibly rich history.
Thank you. So, you have lived here for 3 years and you have chosen Durres as your second home to live in, where you are also attracted by the archaeological side of the city and the sea to settle here. Tell me more about your opinion about Durres city, why you have chosen Durres.
Well, that's a really interesting question. Obviously, I'm quite lucky because when I first started coming to Albania, I was looking at all different parts of the country in order to create some tours and some itineraries to take people around and show them all the sites. So that gave me quite a good insight into the different cities. And I live in London in the UK, so I'm used to living in a big city. So I did spend quite a lot of time in Tirana. And there's nothing wrong with Tirana, but there's something about Durres. Partly it's the sea, but also it's all of those layers of history. It's just such a fascinating city. And I think that when you look at the history of Durres, you realise that the key to its success is its location. So for millennia, it's been a really important city in terms of a port, a harbour and a gateway really to the rest of Albania, and also obviously easy access to Italy. And that's reflected in the rich history that you have here. So for me, it's really important to live in a city where, yes, I've got the sea and I've got the beach and I've got all of those lovely things, but there's the layers of history. So when I leave my house, I walk into the town and I have to walk through the late antique city walls. I walk past the ancient amphitheatre dating to the 2nd century AD, and then I walk into the city centre and I see that there's a late antique forum, and there are all of these interesting buildings from the Italian period. There are buildings from the communist period. There are just so many layers of history, and for me that's what I find really fascinating about it. But I should also add, it's got lots of lovely restaurants and bars and friendly people, so it's got a lot to offer.
You have described so well Durres. Thank you. So, do you think that Durres pays due attention to archaeology and cultural heritage?
It's very difficult when you have a city that's been continuously occupied for so long, and when it is a busy and functioning city. In this case, obviously the biggest port city in Albania. So there are always going to be a lot of pressures on the city and how to preserve its heritage. On top of that, you have to think about the fact that in past times, people weren't always so caring about their heritage. So now, thanks also to pressure from international agencies, countries are more aware about the preservation of artifacts and archaeological remains generally. But that hasn't always been the case. In the case of Durres, because we are in a city that has been a successful city for 3 millennia, every time somebody wants to develop an area in the centre of the city, we've really got to be aware of the archaeological material that might be at that site and under the ground there. And that, of course, comes with its own pressures. It costs developers more because they have to perhaps stop work, they have to allow for delays, time delays, while archaeological excavations or just general investigations are carried out. So it's a stress and it's a pressure. There are some things that have happened in Durres. For example, I was very disappointed to see what happened when some of the city walls, the ancient city walls, were concreted over in the past couple of years. I think that's a shame.
The Valera stuff?
Yeah. I really think that was a shame because we have to look at tourism holistically, not just think about beach resorts, hotels, etc. The cultural heritage sector is a booming sector, or has been until unfortunately we were hit by the pandemic. And these are assets. Durres has lots of assets in its archaeological remains, and these should be preserved rather than concreted over.
Yes, it is very true. So, you have a work experience with museums, starting from the British Museum. How do you access the Archaeological Museum of Durres? Should there be more efforts for its modernization and the creation of medieval sector or underwater archaeology?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that I love the Archaeological Museum. I like to visit it, and it has some absolutely wonderful objects in it. Of course, we have an expectation that at some point we'll be able to see the objects from the later periods of the history of Durres, because at present, obviously, we have the ancient period, but as I understand it, the Byzantine and medieval and later sections are going to be at the upper floor. But I don't have any understanding of what the progress is. So it would be nice to eventually see the objects from the other periods, because at the moment the objects that we have there are wonderful, but they relate to the early periods of the city. It would also be nice to have a little bit more in the way of information panels and labelling. I understand that is difficult because it's my understanding that some of the background material and the documentation was lost during the 90s. But I think even if there was an explanation about that's why there aren't individual labels, etc., it would help to give visitors some context. It's always a question of resources, though, isn't it, with any museum, to have new panels, new interactives, different kinds of programmings. All of these things are welcome, but they all take resources, so sometimes it's a question of that.
These are very valuable suggestions because there are many archaeological finds that just need to be exhibited. So the next questions for you, Carolyn, is through the rich funds of the British Museum, you have challenged the negative images and stereotypes of the Arab world and Islamic cultures. Please tell us more about this experience.
So this is the job that I had at the British Museum, where I was, my title was Arab World Education Officer. And the point of the job was to use the, as you rightly point out, the very rich collections of the British Museum to challenge stereotypes of Arab and Islamic cultures. And it was a really fascinating job, and I very much enjoyed it. Partly because we also had a part of the programme which was involved with outreach. So we could go to different communities in the country and work with them to, not only with children but with adults too, to run programmes to get people to better understand Islamic culture, which is sometimes misunderstood. And the reason why it was so good to be doing this from a museum is that when you can use artifacts and you can use objects from a museum produced by different cultures, that tends to put things in a less controversial and less confrontational light. So everybody can take pleasure in looking at an object or in examining an object that was produced by a different culture. It's less threatening, perhaps. That might be a little bit too strong a way of saying it, but it's a good way of introducing people to different cultures. So if you have people from different backgrounds living in the same country, we can all look at each other's heritage and share that heritage and enjoy that heritage through artifacts, through programming, through lectures, through events, musical events sometimes. In fact, we were very lucky. We had a wonderful nomad tent given to us by Saudi Arabia, and we toured the tent around the country and put it up in different schools and community centres. And children from a very urban lifestyle could understand a little bit more about what it might be like to experience something of the nomad lifestyle.
This is very interesting. We don't do it here in Albania or in Durres, like to go near the schools and to teach children about the historical. We just choose for them to visit the archaeological museum and for them to see it. This is the kind of method that we use, but very interesting. And in Albania, we still have a difficulty accepting and recognizing, such as the installation of the communist regime for almost half a century, or for almost 5 centuries, the Ottoman occupation. How do you think society should act to recognize the truth and to avoid the stereotypes?
This is an issue that is not only for Albania, it's for very many countries. We have to recognise that there are parts of our histories that are difficult, and I can say this absolutely sincerely as a British person, because, you know, we have the whole history of our empire and colonisation, etc. So the key, I think, is education, to educating people about those periods, getting them to understand how those periods came about, what motivations were there, and not to try and cover things up, but to acknowledge that there are ugly periods in every country's history. And one of the things that you can do, as well as educating people about it, is to also, this is a good way that museums and cultural heritage can play a role, such as what is done in Tirana with bunk art, so that people can visit there and they can understand a little bit more about the communist era, which of course is not that long ago. So it's important to take oral testimony now from different sides, people with different experiences, to understand a little bit more, and so that for future generations they will be able to hear about people's experiences in their own words. So it's important to talk to people from different backgrounds, different experiences, and to listen to them. And also, as I say, to not be afraid to confront what people have gone through.
Thank you for your argument. And which Albanian city do you like the most in terms of archaeological treasures? This is a tricky question.
Well, I ought to be very diplomatic here and say Durres. But of course I love Durres because I live here. But perhaps, that is such a difficult question, because this is the fantastic thing about Albania. Each city and each archaeological site has something really, really special about it. Now, I think most people would go for Butrint. So obviously a World Heritage Site, it's also a national park, so it's beautiful to walk around. Even if you don't want to learn much about the remains of the city, you just have a fantastic experience walking around through the lovely trees and having a look at Lake Butrint, etc. But I actually prefer some of the more wild and remote sites. Durres is an absolutely wonderful site for me because it's spectacularly situated. You can see the wonderful views over the Vjosa Valley, and of course that's a very topical thing because at the moment we're very concerned with the preservation of the Vjosa Valley. And when you visit that site, actually you see what an incredible river valley it really is. But I digress. So Durres is wonderful because it's in this fantastic location, but it also gives you a good understanding, I think, of the history of the country, because the Illyrians were very good at building walls, and I've got a bit of a thing about walls. My friends make jokes about me and walls because if you look through my photographs, there's lots of walls in them. I'm a wall nerd. And the walls and the gates at Durres are very, very well preserved. You can see the ancient theatre. You can imagine sitting in the theatre and listening to a play and then having that wonderful view over the valley. And you can see why that place was chosen for a city. Because from the top of that hill, as with actually many of the Illyrian sites, you have a 360-degree view, an incredibly important defensive aspect of the city. So I hope I haven't put people off going on about walls there, but it's really lovely. And it's April now, this time of the year. The site has a carpet of wildflowers. And that's one of the other lovely things about being in Albania, because the sites really are at one with nature, I think.
Yes, that's beautiful. So, you have a blog of your own. Please tell us about it, and if foreigners write to you to know more about Albania, does it happen?
Yes, I do have a blog, and the blog is really about, not only about Albania, but it's also about the other countries that I take tours to. So sometimes about Iran, sometimes about Greece. But I don't get so many people writing to me about Albania on the blog, but I do get a lot of interaction on Twitter. I have a Twitter account, and a lot of people have commented, wow, I didn't think Albania looked like this. They're quite surprised and quite surprised to hear about different connections. I think sometimes people don't even really know geographically where Albania is. They somehow think it's further to the east than it actually is. And one of the things that I like to do with Twitter and other social media is to help people make links easily. So if you say, for example, that Octavian was in Albania, of course it wasn't Albania then, but Octavian was in the city of Apollonia when he heard that Julius Caesar had been murdered and he had to rush back to Rome very quickly. And people suddenly think, what? That happened in Albania? I didn't know that. So, everybody who did Greek at school or ancient history or Latin, so I'm talking about the older generations really, everybody's heard about the Peloponnesian War. And the dispute over Epidamnus, obviously Dyrrachium Durres, where I am now, was one of the causes of the Peloponnesian War. So an incredibly important event that happened here. Julius Caesar and Pompey were engaged in civil war up and down the coast of Albania. There are all these links with ancient history that show how important Albania was in ancient times. And I think if through my social media, that's helping a lot of people understand a little bit more about Albania.
Yes, this is also what we like to do with this series of podcasts. And also some of the podcasts will also be in English for our foreigners to hear them, and why not to visit Albania maybe one day. So, thank you, Carolyn. My last question for you is, what would be your message to all tourists who want to visit the city of Durres?
Well, they should definitely come here. The city has a lot to offer. I don't regret for 1 minute moving here. As I said before, the fact that when I walked through the city, I walked through the ancient city walls, I walked past an amphitheatre. I mean, how many cities in the world can you do that in? But then if I want to, I can go down to the beach, I can watch the sunset, I can eat some lovely food. There's just so much here. It's a very, very rich city in terms of its history, and it's very well connected. I mean, for me, it's great because it's very close to the airport, or I could get a ferry to Italy, or I can pop into Tirana. So the location is very good. And you have to think really that that's why this city has been successful for millennia, because of its location, and that's still as important today as it was in the 7th century BC. So come to Durres.
Thank you, Caroline. We are very pleased to have you as our first guest of our first podcast in the series, The Voice of Cultures. Thank you to all of those who were listening to us, and see you on next podcast. Bye.
Bye-bye, thank you.
Voice of Culture, a series of podcasts by Amphora Media, developed with the support of the Media for All project funded by the UK government. Follow us on the platforms www.amphora.al and also on SoundCloud, Mixcloud, Google Podcast and YouTube.